Hello out there, friends, and welcome to the very first episode of the Muleswriter Chronicles. I am Craig Marlatt, the Muleswriter, and the stories you will hear on this podcast are from my own life as I've traversed the world on my quest for true meaning. Stories many people find either totally outrageous, hard to believe, or both. But are they true stories or just tall tales oozing from the frontal lobes of my brain into the microphone sitting on the desk before me? That is for you to decide. So stay with me for the next several minutes, and maybe you will hear something in this story that sounds like echoes from your own life as well. Now hop up here on my mule and let's get ready for the very first adventure entitled The Yellow Volvo from Hell. I couldn't believe my eyes. I stood there in the parking lot of the Good Samaritan Coffee House and read the IRS letter that had just come in the mail. Dear Craig S. and Jolynn M. Marlatt, your 1984 federal income tax payment was miscalculated, and you overpaid in the amount of $1,800. Enclosed, you will find a check for that amount. If you have any other questions, please call. $1,800. I couldn't believe it. What a blessing from the Lord, I told my wife, Jolynn. You prayed for money for a vacation, and look what happened. God is so good. It had been 2 years since we'd taken a break, and my wife and 3 small children were ready for anything except another hot Florida summer stuck in the apartment. We lived above the Good Samaritan Coffee House, a small ministry we ran as a street outreach to the homeless in Orlando, Florida. Now we could take a couple of weeks off and have a nice trip up the East Coast and get a break from the heat. We could go to New England and visit the Dykstra family in Massachusetts, and then maybe over to Gloversville, New York, where our friends Scott and Agnes had a small golf course they had always wanted us to see. Jolynn suggested that we fly to Boston and then rent a car in Massachusetts to make the run to New York. Our 2 oldest children, Daniel and Julia, agreed with their mom. They had never flown on a plane before, and it sounded exciting to them. Fly? Why would we want to do that, I asked. Let's take the Volvo. I had just purchased a mustard yellow 1971 Volvo station wagon from a Baptist missionary the week before for $1,000, and though it had a few minor problems, I was sure it was ready for a test cruise up the East Coast. Jolynn had tried to get me to take it back, but no way. My friend George and I had already concluded it was just bad gas from sitting unused for the past year. Don't worry, honey, I told Jolynn. It's just been sitting for a while, and after I run a couple of tanks of gas through it, it'll be great. These things run forever. What better way to try this new jewel out than a slow trip up to New England and back? Besides, that old missionary guy told us it ran fine. You know he wouldn't lie to us. He was a good Christian. My wife was especially leery because he had to sign an as-is paper. But hey, the man was a missionary. Why don't we fly, Daddy? My 3-year-old daughter Julia chimed in. I think we're supposed to take a plane like Mommy says. Look, guys, I said, if we spend all our money on plane tickets, we won't have any left to have fun with. Besides that, if we drive, we can go through Williamsburg, Virginia. Wouldn't that be fun to do? I think you kids would really like Williamsburg. It was tough sledding, but Jolynn finally gave in when I said we could go out and buy some new clothes for the trip. 2 days later, we were on our way to Williamsburg. After we hit the Georgia line, the wife and kids were starting to get more settled into the fact that we were driving instead of flying. By then, they could see that the old Volvo was running okay, and in spite of the fact that every now and then the back window on the passenger side would just drop straight down into the door, things seemed to be going okay. That little problem was easily remedied with a piece of stick to shim the window closed, a trick I'd learned from a history of owning cars with the same problem. And by the time we rolled into Williamsburg, they all agreed that old Dad may have been right about the Volvo after all. Our first day there was great, and the kids liked the fact that everybody dressed and talked like they were from another time. They were still a bit young for the history lesson of it all, but they liked the old costumes, the glass blowers, and especially the grist mill where they ground up the wheat and corn to make raw flour for bread. We ate food at some of the early American inns, prepared just the way they did it in the first American settlements, and had homemade syrup on buckwheat pancakes for breakfast. We all had a great time, and Jolynn soon forgot most of her fears about driving the Volvo that far. After 2 days, we left Williamsburg and headed north for our next destination, Whitensville, Massachusetts. The Dykstras were a family who had hosted me in the late 70s when I was a traveling evangelist visiting New England, and we were good friends. Jolynn had been there before, but it was a first for the children, and we were all looking forward to Donna's great cooking. It was about midnight when we passed through Washington, D.C., and came into Baltimore and down into the tunnel that went below Baltimore Harbor. Jolynn and the children were asleep, and as I cruised through the tunnel reflecting on the great time we'd had that day in Williamsburg, suddenly the Volvo gasped and sputtered and gave a horrible shudder as the engine died. We were stuck in the middle of the Baltimore Harbor Tunnel at midnight and had no way to get out. Jolynn woke up immediately and looked at me, wondering what was happening. "Are we out of gas?" she asked. "I don't see how. We've only gone about 40 miles since I filled up back by Washington." "I'll let it cool down a minute, and it will probably start right up," I replied, hoping that would calm any fears that might arise from trouble at such an early stage of the journey. The look she gave me was like a big neon sign in downtown Taipei that said, "I told you we shouldn't drive this thing. Why don't you ever listen to what I say?" "I don't get it. It's been running great," I said, trying to exude as much confidence as I could muster. "It's just some weird little glitch with the battery or something." I didn't have a clue what was going on, but I wasn't going to let her know that. I gave her my biggest Mr. Goodwrench smile, walked over to one of the tunnel emergency phones, and made the call for assistance. The tow truck came right away, and the driver took us just past the tunnel to a parking area they had just for such a situation. I guess it wasn't that uncommon, as they didn't even charge me for towing us out. We sat there and grabbed a couple of hours' sleep, and then, just as though nothing had happened, the Volvo cranked right up, and we headed out. "See, honey," I told my wife, "have a little faith." She let out a grunt that was accompanied by her twisted one-eye look, which meant she was on guard, expecting the worst. She would not be disappointed. Back on Interstate 95 again, I headed for the New Jersey Turnpike, which would take us to New York City. Going through New York about sunrise was what I had planned, hoping to avoid the early morning rush hour traffic and grab breakfast once we got past the city. On long trips, timing is everything, and I pride myself on my ability to hit town just at the right time to avoid the big traffic pileup. "Hey, honey," I said to my wife, "maybe the Lord actually arranged that brief delay back there at the tunnel so we wouldn't get stuck in New York traffic." Being a charismatic Christian, that made perfect sense to me, but my wife had Baptist roots. She wasn't buying it. Aside from all that, other than a few occasional sputters, the car seemed all right, and I told her not to worry. Since we were staying at the Dykstras for a couple of days, I would take it to the Volvo store in Worcester, and they could check it and fix any problems. I was still convinced it was just bad fuel, still getting into the lines every now and then. We arrived in Whitensville, and Alan Dykstra followed me to the Volvo store in Worcester to drop the car off. It was great to be with them, and as we sat around their kitchen table laughing and catching up on old times, the car problem soon faded into the distance. Our 2-year-old daughter Christy kept us all entertained that first night, doing a great imitation of Bette Midler while standing in front of the fireplace and holding the flute chain like a microphone. It was a great time, and it was especially nice to be back with our good friends. After a couple days, the Volvo store called to tell us it was all fixed, and I could pick it up any time. The repair bill was $160. What was the problem, I asked the mechanic. Apparently some old fuel residue was clogging up the fuel pump, he said. Was this car sitting for a while, the mechanic asked. Was I good or what? Jolynn hated it, but she had to admit I knew my stuff. Man, I rode that pony to the bank all that day. Alan Dykstra took the kids out to show them his garden, while Donna, his wife, dropped me off at the Volvo store before she and Jolynn went to Spags. Spags is this great store not far from Whitensville where they sell anything you can possibly imagine. The whole parking lot is filled with semi-trailers loaded with merchandise that you can buy right off the truck. If they don't have it at Spags, you probably don't need it. Alan and Donna were leaving the next day for Florida to visit some family and friends there. We decided to head out just after lunchtime and make the trek to upstate New York. After lunch and lots of goodbye hugs, we loaded up the Volvo and headed out toward the Mass Turnpike. My itinerary would take us through downtown Whitensville, then through Uxbridge and Grafton to I-90, the Mass Turnpike. The kids were laughing and having a great time as we said goodbye to Kelly Road and the Dykstra family. They waved at the cows and horses in the pasture as we passed the little farm where Tommy Dykstra, their teenage son, worked part-time after school. We soon forgot all about fuel lines and tow trucks, confident that everything was just fine. We were going to have a fun vacation and nothing was going to stop us. For about 10 seconds. Suddenly, just like in the Baltimore Tunnel, the Volvo sputtered, let out a big gasp, and died right where it stood. I couldn't believe it. My wife sat silently staring straight ahead, but I knew what was going on in her mind. She could tell by looking at me that it wasn't the time to say anything, but she was going to hold on to it for later when she would remind me of whose idea it was to drive the Volvo. As for me, I was silently speaking to God. Come on, God. Whose side are you on here? We're just trying to have a little vacation. I'm in Boston. Where's Click and Clack when you need them? Once I had the family safely back at the Dykstras, I had the tow truck take me and the Volvo back to Worcester, while Donna helped Jolynn and the kids try to make the best out of things. By this time, my wife had begun to have flashbacks of other trips at other times. One thing I've learned about her, she remembers everything. I'd better solve this problem soon, or I'd never hear the end of it. Being an eternal optimist has its benefits, but at times even a person like me can lose it. I knew that, and I wasn't about to break weak in front of my wife and my 3 beautiful children. I was a preacher, a man of faith. My son Daniel needed me to be a strong example, and my daughters needed to feel safe. Jolynn just needed a vacation. They all needed to know that I was totally confident at all times, and that no matter what the challenge, Dad could handle it. The man at the Volvo store just smiled and said, "Don't worry, we'll get to the bottom of this." In my mind, a little voice added, "If it takes all the money you've got." I ignored that thought, gave him a big smile, and said, "Call me at this number as soon as you figure out what the problem is," to which he agreed. It was a strange feeling the next morning as Alan and Donna stepped over our sleeping bodies camped out in their living room and headed for the Providence, Rhode Island airport in Florida. Like some kind of weird déjà vu, I felt like I'd been there before, as though I was repeating some torment I had lived through in the distant past in another life. Some punishment that must be payment for something I had done wrong to someone, somewhere. Most evangelical Christians don't think much about karma, but at times like this, it's best to look at every possibility. I waved a silent goodbye to them so as not to awaken the children. "Have a great time in Florida," I whispered, and off they went, chuckling something about life always being fun when Craig's around. A few hours later, the mechanic called to inform me that he had found the problem. Apparently all the gunk buildup from the car not running for a year had ruined the fuel pump, which needed to be replaced. It would be about $375, but he guaranteed me that my problems would be over after that. When I picked it up, he told me with pride, "These old wagons are like tanks. They run forever, but they don't like to sit. You'll be all right now, Mr. Marlatt. You and your family have a great vacation." I felt like a tank was running over my head, but I just smiled, forked over the money, and said, "Thanks a lot." New England is great in the summertime. All the covered bridges and old churches with beautiful stained glass windows, the winding rivers, and the historic farms and houses dating back some 200 years. All the property lines there are made of big stones piled up into 2-foot-high walls from when the first settlers arrived and had to clear the land in order to plant crops and build their houses. Looking at those walls and imagining what kind of people it took to settle there always gave me a new respect for how tough they must have been. There's no doubt in my mind that the highest-paid men in early New England were the hernia surgeons. It didn't take me long to get pumped up again, and by the time we reached the Mass Turnpike, I was ready for the old sing-along. I put a cassette in the player, and before long I began to believe the words of the Volvo mechanic. "You'll be all right now, Mr. Marlatt. You and your family have a great vacation." "That's right," I said to myself. "We're on vacation, a free vacation paid for by the IRS. So what if we have a few small challenges? After all, the devil hates what we're doing with the street ministry, helping the homeless, but God is on our side. Come on, kids," I shouted. "Let's all sing one of our favorites. Greater is he that is in me. Greater is he that is in me. Greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world." Like the congregations I'd heard in black churches, I filled in the spaces with shouts of, "That's right, devil, and we got the victory." The kids were easier to convince than Jolene. She kind of sung along, but it was more like a whispered muttering. All the while her ear was cocked to the outside of the car, as though listening for the Volvo to let out the next inevitable gasp or sputter, or worse. That car wasn't about to let her down. I used to live in Massachusetts in my old rock and roll days. My brother Terry and I and our bandmates Pete Middleton and George Sword had played music there on a strip called Washington Street, better known as the Combat Zone, to those who frequented its many nightclubs and striptease bars. All of them were owned by the local mobsters and catered mostly to sailors, bikers, adventurous locals, and the few tougher tourist types who weren't afraid of the occasional scuffle breaking out at the drop of a hat. We called our band the Insanity Machine, which was probably inspired by observing all the local clientele on the strip. This is where all the bookies, loan sharks, pimps, hookers, and drug dealers plied their trade under the paid protection of mafia thugs and Irish and Italian cops. I was a young man of 19 when we started playing there, and there was never a dull moment on Washington Street. In a way, I owe my survival skills partly to that period during the late 60s and early 70s when we stood on stage every night from 7 p.m. until 2 a.m., cranking out music for the local Boston crazies. I saw stuff there that changed my life, and one thing was for sure. If I could outlast the Combat Zone, no little yellow Volvo was going to screw up my family vacation with a wife and kids. Just getting within 50 miles of Boston seemed to stir up that old toughness that had helped me survive those times on Washington Street. And though all the clubs had been torn down years before, a part of what I'd learned there jumped up in me to meet the challenges I was facing head-on in what was quickly becoming the vacation from hell. It was hard getting off the beautiful side roads of Massachusetts and onto the big Mass Turnpike, but we had to make up for time lost in the repair shop. I knew the further we got from our last breakdown, the more my wife could start regaining a little hope for what was left of our vacation. As tough as it was, she tried real hard to keep her fears hidden from the children, but still, every now and then, like a werewolf awaiting the full moon, I could see a dark, foreboding presence behind her eyes as she stared coldly and silently at the black highway that lay before us. We made a brief stop at one of my favorite roadside seafood stands to pick up some fried clams before leaving Massachusetts. After that, it was straight on into the state of New York at 65 miles per hour on Interstate 90. By now, I had my own suspicions about the car, but not wanting to add to my wife's growing paranoia, I kept them to myself, choosing instead to be the ever-upbeat dad who told stories and kept the music playing. What else could go wrong, I said to Jolene. It's behind us now. Let's move on and have a great time for the rest of the trip. I didn't tell her that our money was quickly dwindling, and by now, after Williamsburg, 2 tow trucks, and over $500 in repair bills, that $1,800 was starting to look more like dinner in a movie. I guess it was about 50 miles into New York State that things started really going downhill. I had been riding the draft of a big semi-truck for a while, and finally decided to pass it. As I moved into the left lane and began to speed up and overtake the truck, something really strange happened. I saw a wheel that looked suspiciously like one of my own pass me on the right-hand side of the car and shoot ahead at about 100 miles an hour. I guess the speed I was going kept us aloft for a few seconds, but soon I heard the horrible sound of the steel grinding on pavement and sparks were flying everywhere. As I hit my brakes in a reflex movement, the Volvo lunged to the right just inches in front of the big semi. Somehow, we managed to get to the side of the highway just before the 18-wheeler would have plowed over the top of us. The whole family sat there in shock for what seemed like an hour before we could even say a word. After catching my breath, I got out to see what the damages were. The entire passenger front axle was mangled. The wheel bearing had apparently exploded, and the front wheel had just fallen off at 75 miles per hour. It was a miracle that we were alive, and we all knew it. The trucker didn't even stop. Fortunately, we had come to a halt just beyond a roadway exit with a Texaco station at the top of the hill. Trying to keep things as light as possible in lieu of the circumstances, I trotted up the hill to see if they had a tow truck and a mechanic. "Yes, sir, we have both," the attendant replied. "Which side of the bridge are you located on, sir?" asked the attendant, looking a bit like Mr. Haney from Green Acres. "I'm down in the westbound lane, just west of the overpass. Shouldn't take much to tow me up here and fix that wheel," I said. This is the only luck I've had on this very unlucky trip, to break down right next to a Texaco station with a tow truck and a mechanic. I laughed, but he didn't. He then proceeded to tell me that the New York State Highway Department had set up a system whereby towing operations were divided among bidders geographically. Had my Volvo broken down on the east side of his overpass, he could tow me. Since I was on the west side of the exit, I had to call the company that serviced the next 50-mile stretch and be towed 30 miles west of there. It made no sense, but what had on this trip so far? At this point, I realized that the supernatural was at work here, and that I had been chosen as the next Job, so that God could prove to the devil how much his servant could handle. I made the call to the next towing agency and sat on the side of the road waiting for the great wind to come from heaven and strike the car and kill us all. My wife and children looked on while I began to construct my dung heap from road dirt, tar, and old flattened soda pop cans. I was about to start scraping my boils when the tow truck arrived. He was a cheerful man who tried his best to explain the policy and his helplessness to do anything about it. In light of the unusual circumstances, he said he would only charge me $75 instead of the usual $125. Jolene and the children rode in the truck while I sat in the Volvo being towed to our next appointment with Destiny. There were no songs sung on that portion of the trip. I may have wept some. I don't remember. His station was located in Fort Hunter, New York, which appropriately houses the National Shrine for North American Martyrs. I couldn't stop laughing when the driver told me that. He didn't know why I was so amused, but he probably had gotten an up-to-date history of our journey and may have thought I was snapping from the pressure. I placed a call to my friends in Gloversville, about 20 miles north of Fort Hunter, and they came and picked us up. We gave the mechanic the keys and our friend's telephone number. He said he would call us the next day when he figured out what it would take to get me back on the road again. By now, suicide was not an option. We were way beyond that. I was on a quest. If God was going to test me, I would pass with flying colors. After all, my family and I were still intact. We still had a few $100s left, and here we were with good friends at their beautiful little country club in Gloversville, New York. I decided to give it my best shot at being happy, knowing that God was watching, and we had been especially chosen to represent his side in this weird test of endurance. I went right to bed and woke up early in the morning ready to play golf with my 5-year-old son Daniel. Jolene was numb. As we recounted our adventures to our friends Scott and Agnes, they sat there in a trance and took in every word. They were wonderful people, and Scott had been a PGA professional most of his life, actually holding some record that had not been broken. They had been devoted Catholics most of their lives, and several years before had become evangelical Christians and decided to sell their business and retire to Florida. They would no longer sell alcoholic beverages, and you couldn't run a golf course without selling booze. Scott and Agnes saw this as a sign from God that it was time for them to move on. Our story made perfect sense to them, and they were sure that great blessings lay just ahead for us. God is just testing you, Craig, they told me. Didn't I know it? The next 3 days were lots of fun as I forced myself to forget about the car and have a ball with Jolene and the kids. I determined that my new theme song for this trip would be one of Doris Day's big hits, Que Sera, Sera. Whatever will be, will be. I was prepared to take it as it came and smile all the way to the end. When we did receive the call from Fort Hunter to say the car was almost finished, we had already begun to feel like things were looking up. Even Jolene seemed more chipper. I still had about $400 left, and in a pinch I had my American Express card to see me through. Scott and Agnes drove us back to Fort Hunter, and I went in to see how things were going. Only another hour or so, the mechanic told me. I managed to get a good used axle and save you some money that way. He said it would be about $350, which I felt was cheap, considering all the damage I had seen on the roadside. Our friends wanted to wait until it was finished, but I insisted that it would be all right, and though not without some reservation, they drove away, entrusting my little family to the care of the Lord. As we waved goodbye to Scott and Agnes, the mechanic trotted up from the garage with a new report. Apparently, the axle they delivered was not the right size. It would take a few more hours to get the correct one, and another $50. Okay, the battle is still on, I thought to myself. We turned and went into the diner next to the station to wait and drink a couple gallons of coffee. When we finally did leave Fort Hunter that day, I was down to $8 and some change, and oh yes, my American Express card. I didn't tell Jolynn and the kids how broke we were. I didn't think that would be a good idea. I decided to take a small highway south and catch I-88 to Binghamton, New York, and then I-81 would take me south until I hit I-95 around Philadelphia. It was a good plan, and if I stayed on the interstate, I would be more likely to find gas stations that took American Express. I wanted to save the little bit of cash we had for any tolls we might encounter along the way. There was only one problem with my plan. For over 50 miles, all the gas stations we passed took MasterCard and Visa, but no American Express. We were running low, and no one took my credit card. I finally decided we should stop and spend the night at a motel. I called my secretary and had her wire me some money for the journey home. I knew the hotel would take American Express and thought we'd already had enough surprises for one day. In the morning, we awoke to a message that the money had arrived, and we'd loaded up the Volvo and headed for Binghamton. We got back on I-88, only to find that at the next exit, everyone took American Express cards. This was obviously the outer limits, and at this point I knew anything could happen. And it did. Just outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania, I heard the familiar sound of the Volvo losing power, and when I stepped on the gas, the engine died like so many times before. Though no one else in the car knew it, at that moment something inside me snapped. I calmly pulled the Volvo to the side of the road, went to the nearest phone booth, and booked 5 tickets for the next flight from Scranton Airport to Orlando. It was all over. I had lost the battle. The devil had won. And with an unusual calm silence, I gave up. After about an hour, the car mysteriously started just as it had outside of the Baltimore Tunnel, and I drove to the Scranton Airport. We took our suitcases and left the little yellow mustard Volvo sitting in the airport parking lot with no intention of ever returning or seeing it again. We boarded our flight, and I closed my eyes, hoping to blot out the past 10 days as though they had never occurred. When we had found our seats and strapped ourselves in, I looked over at my wife and children. Somehow they were happy. We had survived the journey so far, and they managed to get their airplane flight after all. It was beyond me, and I had no answers at this point. Once in the air, I started to drift off into a well-deserved sleep when I felt a little tug at my shirt sleeve. Looking down into the beautiful eyes of my daughter Julia, she softly whispered, "Daddy, this is just like my dream." "What dream, darling?" I said to my precious little baby, who looked at me with such innocence and faith. "The night before we left home, I had a dream that we were flying in an airplane, towing the Volvo behind us on a long rope." My entire body shuddered like the Volvo had many times during the last 10 days. I wanted a strong drink, but instead I drifted off into oblivion, my last words being, "That's nice, honey. Go to sleep now." When we finally arrived back at the coffee house, we talked about what had happened. My wife was very kind and didn't beat me to death with "I told you so's." I guess she figured I had suffered all one man could take, and there was not much value to be had from rehashing all the shoulda, coulda, woulda stuff. After finally adding up the expenses of our trip, we decided it had really only cost us $1,000 in actual money, since the IRS check was really a given. All in all, it could have been worse, my wife said, in an attempt to soothe my misery. Then the mail came, and another brown envelope from the Internal Revenue Service. "What could this be?" I said to Jolynn. "Maybe another check." "Dear Craig S. and Jolynn M. Marlatt," the letter read, "we recently sent you a tax refund in the amount of $1,800. That refund was a computer error. Please send the total amount back immediately. If we do not receive the full payment within the next 10 days, you could suffer penalties." Penalties? What possible penalties were left that we had not already suffered in the previous 2 weeks? I couldn't believe it. It was like being released from the psychiatric hospital only to find out your taxi driver for the ride home was Roger Rabbit. I just stood there and laughed, numb to anything new that could possibly happen that week. In the end, we made it through all right. I somehow found the money to pay back the IRS, and soon things were back to normal, whatever that is. My wife was able to add another experience to her long list of "you should learn to listen to me more" epitaphs, and I found out that in a family, though the husband is God's appointed head, he often gives his best ideas to little children. I guess that sometimes when you are absolutely sure you know what God is saying, that's probably the best time to listen a little closer, and it doesn't hurt to give those around you the benefit of the doubt. I eventually went back to Pennsylvania to pick up the Volvo and bring it back home. When I shared the story of our trip with the parking lot manager at the Scranton airport, he felt so bad for me he wiped out the $275 parking fee. He'd had his own bad IRS experience, and in a way, I guess, we were part of a special fraternity of sorts. Funny as it may seem, the car gave me no trouble on the way back to Florida, and I gave it to a friend upon my return. Poor guy. Several years later, my wife handed me a letter from the Department of Motor Vehicles saying that they had found the Volvo on the side of the road and that it was still registered in my name. I wrote them back and told them it belonged to a guy named Beelzebub and that I had no idea of his present address, but thought it was somewhere way down south. Well, that's it for today, folks. Hope you enjoyed the story. This is the Muleswriter saying I'll be back this way in a few days to share another story from my wild and crazy life. Hope you'll join me here again, and be sure to tell your friends to hop on and join us as we meet some of the people and travel to places I've been in my never-ending quest for the meaning to life. See you then.